Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and today we, along with the gods, are going to curse the Gettysburg Campaign, the weather gods. Joining me today are Jon Nese and Jeff Harding, and they have written a really cool book called The Weather Gods Curse the Gettysburg Campaign. Jon, Jeff, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate it.
So the weather gods might be cursed in the Gettysburg Campaign, but I've heard nothing but praise about this book. So first of all, let me just congratulate the two of you on a book that brings like something brand new to the Gettysburg Campaign, which some people think, well, gosh, what new is there to say about the Gettysburg Campaign? You guys have found a lot in a way that adds some meaningful context to the campaign. Jeff, let me start with you. You're a licensed battlefield guide down in Gettysburg. You've read it all, you've seen it all. So how does your book fit into the context of that historiography?
Yeah, well, Chris, I think it really fills a void. There was, there's a million, well, I always tell people 163,000 piece puzzle, right? Roughly the amount of troops at Gettysburg. So and I think one of the key puzzle pieces, if you drop back and make these bigger pieces, maybe a dozen pieces or so of things we need to understand, the weather is certainly crucial. And we were fortunate for years that we had Professor Michael Jacobs records there in Gettysburg, but they didn't give us the level of detail that we were looking for. And as a guide, namely for me, that was heat index, because people were asking me on the buses, in the cars, you name it, Jeff, you're telling me it's 87 degrees on the third day, and that's the highest that the temperature got, but God, I had to feel worse than that. It's summertime, right? And there's always been speculation. So that drove me crazy, and wanted to look into it a little bit more. And that started me down the road, which ultimately and quite fortuitously brought me into Jon's sphere of influence. And he was willing to come in and join this hunt with me.
So, Jon, you're a meteorologist by trade. Someone approaches you and said, hey, let's write a book about Gettysburg. What's going through your head?
My visit to Gettysburg when I was 9, my dad was an American history teacher, and I'd actually had an interest in Professor Jacobs's observations even before Jeff called in 2018. I was at the Franklin Institute Science Museum in Philadelphia, which is deeply rooted in history and meteorology. So I knew a little bit about these weather observing networks in Pennsylvania. I then worked at the Weather Channel, where I did some short features on the intersection of weather and history. And then here at Penn State, of course, have access to really as much data as you can possibly imagine. And so I had a rooted interest in history and Gettysburg as well, but had actually not thought about the idea that Jeff called me about, which was, what can we do about heat index? And that led us down a different path that I think leads to a fairly significant new contribution to the Gettysburg story.
Yeah, I would agree. And you think about heat index, and there's so much more to this book than even is that. You guys both talk about how you discovered all sorts of things as you were putting this book together, and I'll jump into that stuff in just a second. But let's just back up and start with sort of like Weather 101 for folks who maybe are history folks but don't have that science background. Jon, what is weather?
Well, weather is what you feel on a day-to-day basis. It's the hot, it's the cold, it's the rain, it's the snow. It's all those wonderful things that we meteorologists like to measure, right? So whereas most folks talk about the weather qualitatively, today's hotter than yesterday, boy, we've been through a rainy stretch. I need numbers. And so that's the sphere in which I live. And we're fortunate that, as Jeff mentioned, there was a weather observer in Gettysburg during the battle, during the campaign, but he only measured the weather every 8 hours or so, 3 times a day. I needed more. And by the way, the Gettysburg Observer didn't measure critical things necessary to get the heat index. So we needed data from other observers. And so we started looking around and got lucky. Well, sometimes luck is the fruit of good preparation and due diligence. So I like to think I'm kind of lucky, but I work hard at it. So there were observers in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We found a treasure trove of information from the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. And back to your original question, Chris, weather is all those things that we talk about, but meteorologists like to measure.
And that's different from climate how?
Well, you can think of climate as average weather. Weather, to use a baseball analogy, might be how did you do on your latest at bat? Did you strike out? Did you get a hit? Climate would be your batting average, which tells the story of the whole season. And in a similar fashion, that's how you can think of climate. It's the collection of all the statistical information that might exist about various weather variables.
Okay. And then one last question to kind of just make sure we've got a good sense of how you guys pulled all this together. Because you mentioned a second ago that you pulled in data from Harrisburg, you pulled in data from the Naval Observatory in Washington. And someone might say, like, oh, well, that's Washington. That's different than in Gettysburg. Or that's Harrisburg. That's different. How are you able to use data from all these different places to then give you a good picture of what's actually going on in Gettysburg?
An excellent question. And we include the appropriate caveats in the book that directly address your question, but let's talk specifically about the battle. We make strong arguments that the weather in Gettysburg, July 1 through 3, 1863, was very similar to what the weather would have been in Harrisburg, 35 miles up the road. And we make a meteorological argument for why that is. And as many of your listeners know, during the Gettysburg Campaign, the armies were moving north through Virginia, and they weren't that far from Washington, D.C. And so we can make a compelling argument that the Washington, D.C. data provides an excellent proxy much of the time, again, with some caveats, for what the soldiers were experiencing. Plus, the soldiers, and this is thanks to Jeff compiling a 400-page Word document filled with soldier quotes about the weather, the information we glean from these quantitative sources just happens to very much match what the soldiers told us in a qualitative sense.
And Jeff, let me ask you about that because you have you said you had like 1,500 quotes from soldiers that talked about the weather at various points. And kind of going back to John saying when we talk about weather, we say, gosh, it's hot out or it's rainy. So you've got 1,500 quotes about the weather like that. And I'm sure that as a battlefield historian, you've spent a lot of time talking about that. What do you do with that much information? How do you make sense of all of that?
Yeah, yeah, really good question. Because there was a ton of it. And I mean, the thing is that we had some momentum on this project, Chris. I had written a piece in 2018 and then drew John into my interest in this whole project shortly thereafter. And then we did an article for Gettysburg Magazine and we got good reception with that. And then we provided a presentation for the Civil War Institute on our findings. And at that point, we were focusing on the battle. And it was so well received. God bless Carol Reardon and one of my guide colleagues, Teresa Orr. They just couldn't say enough, and others. And so we decided that we'd do a little deeper dive. And the subject of whether we're going to do a book or not, well, let's see what we find. And that's when I went to the grindstone and started putting together every source I could find with information from the soldiers and what they were saying. And interesting enough, now John, he's busy. He's not retired like I'm supposed to be, but he's busy with the television program, teaching, and many other interests. And so we didn't get to it as soon as we originally thought we might, but that was a blessing because I spent a couple of summers hard at it, looking for information. And I mean, Chris, everything from diaries, letters, the OR, of course, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you start looking at all this and it blows you away. And when you read, you've got, just for instance, let's say June 15th, and you've got 100 accounts of June 15th, and you've got Confederate and Union, and you say, oh my God, they're speaking with one voice here, but it's so amazingly descriptive. And I'm excited about it. I'm reading this. I'm thinking, now, I just can't wait for John to get a hold of all this and then tie in this data that we unsurfaced at the Naval Observatory and et cetera, and piece this puzzle together, So finally we had that opportunity and John created a space in his life to really bear down on this. And that's when, to me, the magic started to happen. And John can tell you, he made these huge maps and he's piecing these puzzle pieces together, and that was so exciting.
Yeah. One of the
Yeah,
things go ahead, John.
well, I just wanted to add, Jeff alluded to it. It was extremely interesting to then take some of the maps that Jeff provided showing where the various corps were on a particular day, take them down to the local printer, have them blown up 3 foot by 2 foot maps, and then start looking through the soldier quotes. And we know approximately where they were based on the regiment, for example, and start writing on the maps that this soldier said this and this soldier said that. And then you begin to see the patterns emerging. And of course, some days, Chris, living, where you do here in the mid-Atlantic, that it could rain 10 miles from your home on a given day, but at your home, everything's fine, right? The softball game's canceled down the road because the field's a quagmire, but you're questioning what's going on here. That's summer weather, and this is summer. And so we would get different reports from different individuals. It rained here, didn't rain there. That affects, of course, if it's cloudy, it's cooler usually. And so, but you still, through all of that, you begin to see the patterns. And then it's extraordinarily gratifying to then have some numbers from official observers to sort of back up what the soldiers were telling us.
Yeah. And I was just going to say that the maps that you put together for this book are really cool. And the fact that they're in color really add a lot of neat dimension to it too. So you guys are very well served by the graphics and the color that you guys were able to put together for this.
That's good to hear, Chris.
Thank
And really, we owe that to History Press. They went out of their way. It's not something they normally do, but we kind of bargained for that color insert. And having seen a couple of those maps that John had created, I said, we have to have this. And it's nice to hear. So thank you.
Yeah,
I wanted
really-
to
really
mention real
brings out-
quick before I forget, and I'm sorry, Chris, this thing of these soldiers and all their accounts. And I just said this to John the other day. It struck me. I've been digging a little bit on the Battle of Franklin lately and learning some things there, and the armies and the weather they were dealing with later. And, that's cold weather. It's winter weather they're dealing with, and et cetera. But there's a dearth of weather reporting in the South during the Civil War. Any of the observers that were part of what was known at the time as the Smithsonian Meteorological Project, of which Jacobs was a part, the Harrisburg observers were a part. They basically don't observe during the Civil War, or they're unable to get their reports in. Either way, we don't have any reporting. So you have this absence of data, but you have these armies all over the place, in essence, right? You've got, 40,000 guys in the general vicinity. You've got 50,000 over here, and so many of them write about the weather. So from a meteorologist perspective, you've got sources. Now, you don't have that hard data that, of course, they want, the temperatures and that type of thing. There's nobody out there with thermometers to speak of, but you do have a lot of information that you wouldn't otherwise have. So you don't have the official reporting, but you've got some supplemental reporting, which is, I think, from their perspective, is nice.
And you talked about, I really like the idea that, you've printed out these maps and you're plotting soldier locations. And a lot of people maybe don't realize that the Army of Northern Virginia took one route up into Pennsylvania. The Army of the Potomac takes two different routes because it's split into two different wings. And so you do have these different localized weather situations for these different soldiers at different times on the same days, or, so it's really neat that you guys thought to map that out. That seems like a pretty brilliant stroke of genius, if I don't mind saying so.
Well, that's nice. Thanks.
Appreciate that. I wanted to add one thing, Chris. You referred to some of the color images in the book. I think most folks who follow the weather to some extent have heard us meteorologists talk about the computer models. Most folks know that meteorologists have this helper when it comes to forecasting. All the equations that govern how the air works are thrown into a computer, and we solve equations and make forecasts. And of course, forecast implies you're going forward in time. Well, the same organization that creates those computer models here in the United States, which is your National Weather Service, you pay for this with your federal tax dollars, also has a tool that enables you to look backward. In other words, reanalyze or reconstruct what the weather might have looked like on a particular day in the past. And this particular tool is available online to anybody who wants to play with it. But I think Jeff and I are the first to ever use it to assist with reconstructing weather maps during the Civil War. And so many of the color images you refer to come from that product, which helped us. And it's not gospel, it's just guidance. It's just another tool in the toolbox to help reconstruct what would have been happening meteorologically.
You talk about forensic meteorology in the book and sort of trying to dig back and uncover and figure this out. How accurate is that as guidance? Is it brand new technology? Is it pretty well tested? Is it tested in certain ways but not in others?
Well, generally speaking, the farther back you go in time, the less trustworthy, the bigger the error bars are going to be. This particular reconstruction tool has been tested on some big storms of the 19th century and done pretty well. Another point to make is that this reconstruction tool comes with the ability to estimate the uncertainty. So we don't talk a lot about that in the book, but we do put error bars on a number of the numbers that we report. So let's just say I think it's part of the toolbox, and you can't ignore, however, things that the soldiers are saying. You can't ignore, for example, what the observer in Washington, D.C. said, because that's ground truth. So it's one of the tools, but it's not the only tool.
Yeah. How and you talk a little bit about this in the first chapter, but how sophisticated were weather gathering initiatives in the pre-Civil War era? The Smithsonian certainly had an initiative that you guys talk about, but how far along was weather science or meteorology at the time?
Well, theoretically, in terms of understanding concepts, words such as front, which most meteorologists talk about on TV, and you probably heard a cold front, warm front, that was not regularly used at the time. But they knew about air pressure and how important it was. You hear us meteorologists talk about high pressure, low pressure, and relate that to the weather. So that was known. And the instrumentation was pretty good, particularly at the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. One would argue that it was state of the art. And there were thermometers, there were wind vanes, there were instruments to measure the speed of the wind. They're called anemometers. There were instruments to measure air pressure. They're called barometers. Those were well established. And then to the point of the research that got Jeff and I initially together, there were instruments to measure humidity. And that's what you need if you want to compute a measure such as the heat index, which combines temperature and humidity. At least it purports to combine temperature and humidity to give you sort of a feel-like temperature.
And Jeff, I want to go back to a statement you said earlier about these guys on the field, they're not carrying thermometers, but you've got all this data. So you had, again, going back to those 1,500 quotes or so you said. In my writing classes, I tell my students, to be as specific as possible when you're writing. If you say, gosh, it's hot out. Well, what does hot really mean? Because hot to one person is not hot to another. I actually use cold as my example. My wife is a Virginian, and so when it's 60, it's cold. I've lived in Maine much of my life. When it's 60, it's like t-shirt and shorts weather, right? So like, what does cold really mean? So you've got all this data that you've had to sort through, and then it becomes the stuff that Jon likes to measure. So you've got all this information that suddenly provides context for these quotes.
Mhm.
I've got to imagine as the picture started to come into focus with the data and these models that Jon has talked about, that these quotes suddenly had a new meaning to you as a historian.
Yes, exactly, Chris. And that's part of what drove me in the first place, because as I began to get into this, looking deeper into what Jacobs had observed and was there anything that would give us heat index, et cetera, started kind of going back to looking at what had been written and secondary accounts. And so many of those then will have the quotes from the primary source. And I'm reading And there's some that are very colorful, very descriptive. And you start to look at it and go, geez, I mean, was this guy embellishing a little bit or, exaggerating? What's going on here? But then, you look at the totality of, quote after quote after quote is equally as severe, perhaps. But when you got the numbers, that's when the light bulb went on. It's like, wow, this brings a new meaning to it. No, he wasn't exaggerating. I mean, I don't think really in all those quotes I looked at, Chris, that I could pull any number of them out where I would say, this guy's just, he's too much. Because so many of those were, Randolph Shotwell from 8th Virginia, he's got so many, you'll see him in a number of books, some of his very descriptive, the guy wrote colorfully, right? But you go back and look now, and he's writing on June 17th when the heat index was estimated around 117 degrees, 118. And okay, he knew what he was talking about. He's living it. Who am I to say? But this certainly validates it. And that Naval Observatory data, and John will talk more about this, it really, and we talk about it in the book, was a gold mine to us because when Bob Crick wrote his wonderful book, Civil War Weather in Virginia, he's using a lot of the Smithsonian Meteorological Project records. And for DC, he was using an observer in Georgetown. And that was fine. But it turns out the Naval Observatory records weren't part of the Smithsonian project. That's a separate. And we found this in the NOAA system of records. And boy, when we came upon it, and that's thanks to a lady down at NCEI, National Climate Environmental. John, is that right? NCEI?
National Center for Environmental Information.
There you go.
And by the way, NOAA, for those listeners, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is the parent organization for the National Weather
Service. Thank you, John. Yeah. So a wonderful woman there, Janet Wall, she put me onto that observatory data. And then, of course, when I was able to get with John on it, we just couldn't believe it. 8 observations a day. And more than just taking the temperature, they were observing the atmospheric moisture via what's called wet bulb. And John can get into that with you. But other things as well, like they had 2 thermometers self-registering that would give you the high temperature, one of them, another would give you the low. So we had that. And then they even had a special thermometer a few inches off the ground that would give you great insights to what it might felt like as a soldier laying on the ground. And I think they called that, John, was the sun temperature.
Sun temperature, solar thermometer.
Solar thermometer, yeah.
Wow.
So
yeah, and you think about guys who get wounded, for instance, and that's a different experience than the guy who might be marching across the field or feeling the breeze or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And left on the field, and you read those accounts too when the guys are in the field hospitals after the battle. And exactly, Chris.
Wow. Yeah, John, can you unpack some of that data that Jeff talks about? You find this treasure trove. You're a guy who loves data. What was it like to find this treasure chest?
Prior to Jeff making me aware of the data set, I had not really looked at Naval Observatory data. I want to emphasize something that Jeff said. I think most folks are used to hearing a meteorologist talk about the high and the low temperature. What's the highest the temperature is going to reach this afternoon, and what will the lowest temperature be tonight? Most of the observers at that time did not measure those 2 numbers. They did not have the specialized way of doing that. Because unless you're up 24/7 staring at your thermometer, you just don't know what the highest and the lowest is. But the observers at the Naval Observatory had those specialized thermometers. And that was important because that allows you to find the max and the min. And so they also, and we might as well talk about it now, the Naval Observatory had this special thermometer. Actually, it's a set of 2 thermometers that are mounted next to each other, that together the instrument is known as a psychrometer. And the principle is actually pretty straightforward. I suspect, Chris, you and your listeners know that when you step out of the shower or you step out of a swimming pool, you feel a bit of a chill on your skin. And that's because some of the water on your skin is evaporating, stealing energy from your body. And even so, evaporation of water is a cooling process. In fact, it's one of the primary ways your body cools, by evaporating perspiration. Well, that same principle is used in meteorology. We take a thermometer and we put a sock, literally a piece of cloth, on the bulb of the thermometer, and we wet the sock. And so what happens is water evaporates from the sock, and the thermometer, the bulb, cools down. And so such a thermometer will read a lower number than another thermometer nearby that doesn't have a sock on the bulb. And if you know the difference between the temperature on the regular thermometer and the temperature on the thermometer that has a sock on the bulb, if you know the difference between those two, you can calculate humidity. And that instrument is known as a psychrometer. And the thermometer that has the sock on the bulb is called the wet bulb thermometer, because the bulb is wet.
Right.
And it's that instrument that provides the insight you need to compute the humidity of the air and estimate the heat index.
And it seems to me like heat index is kind of like the key that drove this whole discussion and drove this book. But you guys ended up finding out so much more. You know, you talk about intensity of sunlight, for instance, and just how that has an impact on the soldiers in different ways, and the temperature closer to the ground than it is, you know, if you're standing up. So like it's almost like the book is full of these cool little secrets that maybe aren't secrets, but like cool little discoveries. Jeff, let me ask you, like, what's one of the coolest insights that you guys were able to uncover that really stuck out for you?
I think, well, just sort of overarching, as far as having somebody from John's world weigh in on this subject, there's been things written over the years, and really, to my knowledge, and John can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was the early 1960s, a weather meteorologist slash historian, weather historian, David Ludlam, had taken a look at the Gettysburg Campaign, and it was a nice article in Weatherwise magazine back then, and kind of touched on things. I don't think there's ever been one involved in a book-length treatment specific to certainly the Gettysburg Campaign. So to me, Chris, that was the overarching first, if you will. I think we have a number of firsts in the book. Certainly, I wanted, as a guide, I've always, you know, you're familiar with Busey and Martin's work. If you want to know regimental strengths and losses during the battle, you got to have Busey and Martin, right? And you go to that. And so I had in my mind to have something like this for the weather, because as historians, you want to know on any given day what was the weather like. And so I wanted a day-by-day account. So we have that and other things. But really, I think, is where the rubber meets the road. Because at the end of the day, that's great. And these guys lived in it. It's important to know what they went through. But then you start to look at impact. Could this have changed anything? Yes or no? All right. It doesn't have to be yes to be meaningful. No, it's fine too. But you want to look at these things and figure out, you know, what does this all mean at the end of the day? And so we touch on this some in the book, and especially with regard to the battle and to the retreat as well. But as far as the battle is concerned, focusing on day 2, because people have always thought day 3, it's hot. Now we knew the 87 degrees at 2 p.m. Now we know a lot more, and we can get into that. But as far as day 2, the understanding had been, well, 81 degrees, that's the high temperature. Well, it's not the high, because we didn't know the high, right? Jacobs was only observing 3 times a day, but at 2 p.m. we knew it was 81. So when you think about Law's brigade marching in from the mountains to get to the battlefield, and their hard march just to get to Gettysburg, 20 miles, then the counter march to get in position, add what you like, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 more miles. Now they're in position, and soon enough they're going to launch the assault. They're the tip of the spear. So what did 81 degrees mean to what these guys were experiencing and their fighting capability that day? Did they have water? Did they have proper rest? And now we know 81 degrees, forget it. We know the heat index made it significantly warmer, or at least feeling. And then we start to look at things, Chris, that doesn't get talked about a lot, but everybody knows it. You're outdoors, it's hot, you're in the shade, it feels like one thing. You step out in the sunlight, well, now you're adding, you know, you're raising the number to a power. How much? And the National Weather Service will tell you 10 to 15 degrees, depending on circumstance. And that draws in a whole nother bulb too, Chris, because it's called the wet bulb globe. And we can get into that, the angle of the rays you mentioned and things like that. So to answer your question, I think there are a lot of firsts. But for me, from the history side of the equation, I'm looking at the impact. What can we do with this now? Can we open some discussions?
Yeah, very good. John, how about you? Anything jump out as something you weren't expecting to discover that, wow, this really brought some insight?
Well, I think I'll piggyback on something Jeff said. I remember the first time I ever heard this meteorological thing that I'm going to mention on television. It was during the 2020 Olympics, Summer Olympics, which I guess were actually competed in 2021 during the marathon. And the announcers brought up on the screen something called the wet bulb globe temperature, which is a mouthful, but basically think about it this way. What affects how you feel when you're outside? Well, there's the temperature and the humidity, which we've talked about, yields a heat index. But are you in the sun or not? That makes a difference. Is the wind blowing or not? That makes a difference. Well, it turns out the military and many athletic teams have been using this measure called the wet bulb globe temperature, which provides an estimate of how dangerous it would be to be outside, either marching or competing under those conditions. And so we actually computed this measure a couple places in the book. And the great thing about the wet bulb globe temperature is it actually comes with recommendations of how much water you should be drinking and how much rest you should have in a given hour if this wet bulb globe temperature reaches certain thresholds. Now that's relevant. That is directly relevant to what we're talking about here. So it was using this measure, which, I mean, most people, even meteorologists, many meteorologists don't know a lot about it, but when you can start talking about impacts and precautions that one should take, that's when, as Jeff said, the rubber really meets the road.
Right, right. You talk about how safe it is to be outside. And of course, we also have to factor in there's like a 95% chance of falling balls of lead too, which makes things a lot more
Yeah,
difficult too, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me about the human element that is also part of how we perceive heat. And what here I'm talking about, and Jeff, you alluded to, how long they've been marching, but also the clothes that they're wearing, maybe where these guys were raised and are they used to heat or not? Like that also has an impact on how we experience heat and coldness too, I think.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating subject and could be another book.
Yeah.
Probably not for John and I. We use a break. We are on to a couple other things actually, but it's another story. But really, we wanted to cover these things in the book as much as possible. We had limits, right? There's always a word count when you're doing a book, so you hit what you can. We did include a write-up on uniforms. And I was fortunate because folks down at the Medical Museum in Frederick, Maryland, Civil War Medical Museum, were very kind to share knowledge, look at what I'd written with regard to uniforms, talk to a number of folks at Reenact and at Gettysburg National Military Park as well. And you'll see them mentioned in the book. But to get a better feel, because the misnomer is always the first thing out of someone's mouth, and they were in those wool uniforms. Well, yes and no, right? So we talk about this in the book. We split hairs a little bit, but by and large, the Southerners are wearing what's called jean cloth, which is a wool cotton blend. Makes a difference. So there was one reenactor, Chris, and you're familiar, and most of your audience is going to be familiar with the Sixth Corps march in from Manchester, right? 34 miles, 19 hours. And so it becomes important. How often are they taking breaks? Are they getting water? And as it turns out, much more so than Law's Brigade, which is basically marching at the same time, July 2nd anyway. But there was a reenactor who was kind enough to share his experience. There were articles about him in his local newspaper and everything. He's mentioned in the book, but he marched, the Sixth Corps marched to Gettysburg. And boy, this guy could speak to the fatigue of what they experienced. And he wasn't in anywhere near what quite the weather that the Sixth Corps had been through leading up to that point, which it takes a toll. John brings this up in the book. What about the evening temperature? Because that's the time you think you're going to recover. Not necessarily so, so yes, that. Now, how about where you're from? And John and I are still digging on this. We've really talked to some people that have a large degree of expertise in this subject, I think, because the knee-jerk reaction is, if you're from the north, you probably didn't deal with the heat as well as the Southerners. But what John and I noticed in the quotes, and we love to say this, John and I both, the soldiers were equal opportunity complainers about the heat. I mean, even if you're from the South, and this is my layman's point of view, in the heat of the day, a really terribly hot day, you're not going to be out working hard or marching 20 or 30 miles and wearing a full set of clothes, no matter what they're made of, right? People were smart, and they'd stay in the shade, they'd stay indoors, they'd go in the cool cellar, whatever, swimming hole. So did they have a greater tolerance for it? Maybe, maybe not. You can argue, and you need to go to some experts on that. We did find, though, a wonderful document from the United States Army that talks about what's necessary to truly acclimate someone to an increase in heat, like soldiers would experience over in the Middle East now, in the desert, that type of thing. So it's a pretty extensive process, as I read it, and it can be done. And there was no organized way of doing that in the Civil War, certainly. If it occurred by happenstance, I would say, Chris. The guys are with the Army quite a while. They're on the hard march, and they're used to it after a while. Maybe it's more these troops that have been garrisoned, that were just added to the Army, right? And now they're not quite used to campaigning. I think it comes into place certainly there. But yeah, there's a lot of things that you can springboard off of in terms of these discussions. It's all fascinating.
Yeah.
And if I might add, Chris, I think an overwhelming sense that we got was that in the end, hydration and rest, in the end, are probably more important than where you're from.
Right.
Yes, yeah, exactly. How much you got, and again, it goes back to the Sixth Corps.
If
You
you're
were counts the Sixth Corps coming to Gettysburg, Littlestown. They're bringing out buckets of water for these guys, right? And Lost Brigade's coming in. Nobody's giving them buckets. They're drinking out of dirty mud puddles if they can find it. So John's exactly right. I was just going to add this real quick because you didn't ask this, Chris, but just one thing I love about doing these podcasts, I get to see John and I have probably had thousands of conversations on the phone working on this book. We live about, what is it, John, 6 hours apart, probably. We've met a total of 2 times in person. So I'll just tell you, and hopefully it conveys through the screen, the excitement we shared over the discovery process on all of this. It has not abated. Like I said, we've got a couple other things cooking, so to speak. But yeah, it just was too much fun. It still is. And we just hope, and we didn't start this, Chris, to say, hey, we're going to go write a book. I think I kind of explained that. But you learn as a historian, and certainly as a scientist, meteorologist, things that you need to share with people. And that's what we were all about with the book, trying to share as much as we could of what we had learned.
Yeah. One of the neat ways that you organize the book, aside from the chronological divisions, but you also have sort of these subsections. When weather mattered the most, people stories and matters to remember. Tell me where you came up with the idea for these kind of ways to highlight certain aspects, because I thought that was really helpful going through the book.
Yeah, well, it's something that we discussed, went back and forth on a little bit. We knew things that we wanted to say, and we basically tried to get our arms around organizer by saying, look, we've got to, before we get into a given chapter, let's have one. And we ended up basically dubbing it a situation report. And let's give everybody, the situation, what's going on with the armies at this point, where they're moving, what they're doing. And then I wanted John to be able to present his case, if you will. Let's set that stage. We know where they're going, what they're doing now. Let's see what the weather is like that's surrounding them. And so then John was all about his maps and forensic analysis and all the tools. And you can see John's not a mad scientist, but I always pictured him in there with those big maps and just having a ball with all this stuff. And then we talk about this in the introduction of the book. The great quote, I use it on tours, I've used it many times. Rudyard Kipling, if history were taught in the form of a story, we would never forget it, right?
Yeah.
And as a guide, it's important to share stories. And when you study, become a guide, you have to know every nth degree about the battle, Civil War, you name it, political, socioeconomic. But when you got a 2-hour tour with a family that's been in Philly, they're going to DC, you've got them for 2 hours. They don't need 55 names and every little detail in every regiment. Are they from Minnesota? Yes, you're going to show them the first Minnesota, no doubt about it, right? And what happened there. But the stories that when you take them on the battlefield, the Kate Hewitt, John Reynolds story, right? That's our first stop on the battlefield. And that's where you start to draw them in, because you can give them all the facts you want. They're not going to remember what happened there. But you give them a few stories and they're going to go, oh, I've never forgotten that first day's battlefield, what happened out there. Remember Kate Hewitt, the secret, that kind of thing, Chris. And I think that's what makes a difference. So we wanted that in the book. So we tried to include some stories and people and matters to remember as well. So some of those poignant stories that you probably read when you read the book, Chris, is why they're there. And then about the weather observers. We thought some of these weather observers stories certainly deserve to be told.
Yeah. And John, as the guy who's crunching the numbers and looking at the data and stuff, tell me your take on those sort of human interest elements that you guys made sure that you included.
Well, to be honest, initially, it wasn't clear to me how we were going to fit that in. In the end, it was absolutely the right thing to do. I was particularly interested in telling the stories of the observers, who they were, what they did when they weren't observing the weather. John Eastman at the Naval Observatory really was an astronomer. I mean, the truth is, at that time in the 1860s, there weren't really many people who called themselves meteorologists. They were natural philosophers, or they went by other names, but you don't really see that term being used at that time. But what you had is a husband and wife team in Sykesville, Maryland, who shared duties, where the Harriet Bear may very well have been the first woman to take official weather observations. The folks who observed in Harrisburg, one was a medical doctor, another owned a printing business. And then, and Jeff really had me intrigued, there are some missing observers that we really wish we had. For example, we know there was an observer and correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, Leitersburg,
No, you're right.
And we know this because his name is in all the books of observers. And we also know this because he published articles after the fact about how much rain fell during a given year, which means he must have been taking daily observations so he could add up the numbers. But we can't find his daily observations. And by golly, wouldn't it have been useful? And I guess I left the punchline out. Leitersburg is near Hagerstown, which information like that would have been extraordinarily valuable during the retreat. But we don't have the daily numbers. And so those kinds of stories really, as a data guy, those hit me.
Yeah. Mentioning the retreat, one of the other unique things your book does, among many, you really spend a lot of time with the water table as Lee's army is trying to get across the river, and you talk about the water levels and how the rain had impacted that. And it's really the first time anyone's took that close a look at this. What made you guys decide to really examine that, and how did you go about doing that, and what did you find?
God bless John. I'll tell you that, Chris, because from a historian's perspective, there are any number of books about the retreat, some great ones, right? Yeah. The situation, what's going on with the weather, is covered extensively. So I would go to John and say, well, here's what, I've talked to some colleagues, here's my feelings, what we need to know more about that hadn't already been said. So there was a whole lot of that leading up to the battle, even during the battle, but the retreat, we had to look at it a little differently because it had been covered in terms of rainfall. But what I noted was that Jacob's rainfall figures were all that people were using to base their commentary on what occurred with the rain. And so we didn't have the observer. There had been an observer, Chris, in Chambersburg. Wouldn't it have been nice to have his information? Leitersburg, that John mentioned, Winchester. And none of those reports are at the Smithsonian. One gentleman did keep a diary, and we found that. but the one from Leitersburg newspaper article quoting the weather and the rainfall month by month in 1864. And he said it wasn't anything, basically, I'm paraphrasing, compared to what we had in 1863. Where's the 1863 date? Oh my goodness, that close, close. But anyway, I said to Jon, I said, look, let's try to get our arms around if we can. And looking at rain, I learned from Jon, it's a whole different ball of wax from temperatures and everything, especially summertime rains. But I wanted to get if we could, collectively, our arms around as much as possible how much rain we felt actually fell to cause the situation at South Mountain when the Confederate Army's crossing over, and then the situation, most importantly, at Williamsport when Lee's army begins to arrive, and it's at a point, the river's so high, they can't ford the river. Their pontoon bridge, of course, the Yankee cavalry had taken care of that coming up out of Harper's Ferry. That's gone, been destroyed. They got to rebuild that. So they're trying to rebuild that. They're waiting for the river to fall. They're using a few ferries, but man, how much rain fell to cause all this? So over to Jon.
Well, I fought Jeff tooth and nail about whether we should include chapters on the retreat, because it wasn't clear to me what more could be said, to be honest. But then once I realized, okay, we know approximately how high the river was in 1863 that prevented Lee from crossing. So why not do the following? We have modern day river level data from Williamsport, Maryland, going back into the 1990s. So why don't we just look at that data and find other times in the last 30 years when the river at Williamsport has risen to a level that we think it was when Lee was trying to cross. Mm-hmm. So in other words, find some modern proxies, and then dig into the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration database and see how much rain fell in the drainage basin of the Potomac during those recent times when the river level reached what we think it was when Lee was trapped in Williamsport. So that's what I did. And, once again, kudos, thanks to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the National Weather Service, their hydrologists at their river forecast centers for helping me get the data. And so basically, we came to the conclusion that it would take somewhere between 3 and 4 inches of rain falling in the drainage basin of that part of the Potomac River for the river to rise to the level essentially equivalent to what Lee saw in 1863. And that was kind of fun to do, a little bit of reverse engineering. And then another interesting point that we discovered was in the last 30 years, there are no July proxies for what happened in July of 1863. In other words, I couldn't find any modern day equivalents that occurred in July. And there's meteorology and hydrology behind that. But the point is, turns out that it's not that common for the river to reach that level in the month of July at Williamsport, Maryland, which was, I think, kind of interesting.
You have a great italicized line in your last chapter. Let me see if I can find it real quick, where you say that regarding the weather, we believe our analysis demonstrates the cruel irony that the Gettysburg Campaign occurred during one of the most ill-fated weather-related time frames possible. I mean, that is a big statement. And I guess what you're saying there, Jon, like, geez, you don't have flooding in July, just further underscores that idea that this campaign takes place in what turns out to be an extraordinarily bad weather time for these armies, which I don't think people realize.
And we didn't talk much about the details of the June heat wave, but we have some statistics in the book that essentially document how unusual we think it was to have a heat wave like the one they had from June 15th to 18th, 1863, as the armies were coming north through Virginia, how unusual that heat actually was, even compared to modern times.
Yeah, and that's what led us to the title. Chris, you teach writing, and I'm sure you tell everybody, don't start with the title of the book, let it come to you, right? And we had no intention on naming the book what we ended up naming it, or titling it, excuse me. But the more we looked at what happened with the heat wave, certainly the battle worse than we had known. Pickett's charge, heat index upwards of 105, again, a shade measurement, things like crop sweat that we bought, all this stuff and then the retreat, knowing how unusual that was in terms of the rise of the Potomac in early July, mid-July. So yeah, it came to us. The weather gods did indeed curse the Gettysburg Campaign, no doubt about it.
We did argue a bit about the verb.
Yeah, we did.
You had
Yeah,
some other choices besides curse.
Oh, we had a lot. And Chris, I tell you, I mean, it's almost embarrassing. It was like 4 in the morning or something. I'm laying there and can't get back to sleep. And I'm like, oh yeah, this will work.
I've
We
had
got a
those
little
moments.
pushback on one of the verbs, but hopefully folks liked it.
I think my big takeaway from this book is that certainly we knew it was hot. Your question about what's the index, heat index, and so how does it really feel heat? But like, I think the cumulative takeaway then for me was like the the magnitude of suffering that both of these armies went through because of the weather that made this campaign, which was already extraordinary, much more extraordinary than we realize it really was.
Yeah, good point, Chris. I'm looking for my little cheat sheet here. I got it. This was interesting to me. Medical surgical history of the United States Civil War, right? The tome that so many rely upon. For June of 1863, the Army of the Potomac had 58% of all cases of sunstroke. 58% of all armies cases of sunstroke was the Army of the Potomac. 18.2% for all the other armies.
Wow.
So that speaks for itself in terms of what they were shouldering in June of 1863. And you've got a lot of guys falling out, and unfortunately many of them die. And had they only understood wet bulb, would they have stopped marching as far? Maybe not. You got to do what you got to do in the military, but certainly it's a wet bulb globe, excuse me, that needing to rest, needing to get your water is crucial. And if you don't, you're going to have heat stroke and you're going to have deaths.
I suppose that gives some different context when, I'm sure you've heard this question, Jeff. People are like, well, what if Stonewall Jackson had been at Gettysburg? Well, knowing the heat index, he probably would have killed all his men marching him like he typically would.
He may very well have, there's no doubt about it. He drove them hard.
So as we head into the home stretch, let me ask a question that is intentionally devil's advocate. I'm not a Gettysburg guy. Why should I read this book? What's it going to do for me?
That's a really good question. I don't know if we've had that one, John. I mean, you would hope. We expect that people interested in weather are going to want to read it. People interested in history, certainly Gettysburg.
Yeah,
go ahead, John.
For me, the book is an attraction for anyone who has an interest in history and how the weather plays a role in history. I mean, it's not for everyone, but I think that blend is interesting. It's provocative. And so anyone with an interest in the Civil War and weather, this book is for you. And it teaches you a little bit of both. I mean, we don't assume ahead of time that anyone knows all that much about the Gettysburg Campaign, and we certainly don't assume that anyone knows anything about the weather. So it'll teach you a little bit of both, and it'll do so in a storytelling manner that I think turned out pretty well.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, John. Yeah, I think, Chris, the stories too for me is, I mean, I want people to go in there and read about the Medal of Honor recipient that helped save his fellow soldier who had fallen with heat stroke, and read about the Buck family and Dad, who was an amateur weather observer, and his plight of his son. Those type of stories really bring the color to it, So I think it's just the whole ball of wax is something that most people, if you have a heartbeat, you're going to appreciate those things. And there's something there for everybody ultimately.
Yeah, and I'll provide my own answer too, because my background tends to specialize in the overland campaign, and your book really gave me a lot of things to think about that I've already gone back and looked at the weather during the overland campaign and how can I better understand its impact on the campaign that's familiar to me. So your book's kind of like a case study that then helps me better understand my battles and battlefields. So that was super important and helpful takeaway for me, and I think
that's good to hear.
Yeah.
Oh,
because we've postulated that maybe we have a model here for folks to follow. Are they going to get Jon Nese involved? That's up to them. or you. But I think there's the model in place for folks to follow if they want to know more about the weather during any given campaign.
Yeah. So, anything I haven't asked either of you that you wished I had that you want to get in real quick?
Wow. I don't know. Stay tuned. We're going to be speaking in different places, and we're going to be doing some neat stuff. We may actually get some people out eventually and do some 19th century weather observing together with the sock on the thermometer and these kind of practical experiments. We're a couple ideas, and we got I alluded to this a couple of times. A couple of things coming, in particular, things that folks haven't had their hands on, Chris. So weather during the aftermath becomes crucial, and August is going to be an eye opener for folks. And then we have. To my knowledge, Chris, no one's ever had their hands on Professor Jacobs' original records for November 19th, 1863. We do.
Okay. Stay tuned. Dun, dun, dun.
Exactly.
John, anything you want to add, John? Yeah.
No, I think you've covered all the bases, Chris. It's just been an amazing couple years for me, and feel immensely grateful to have been able to put something together with someone who knows more about Gettysburg than anyone I've ever met.
Yeah.
That would be Jeff.
I was going to say, you're working with somebody else then, John. Thank you. I'm humbled. And really, I mean this in the most sincere way. What a blessing for me to meet John and have a guy who's at the top of his field in his realm, but also deeply interested in history, which stemmed from his dad having taught history, and just truly blessed, and blessed with all the people that have supported the book. From Carol, Dr. Forbes, who wrote our afterword, when you read the blurbs, all those people, yeah, I'm in their debt. So, and thank you, Chris. Thank you for your interest.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Yeah, my privilege. So the book is The Weather Gods Curse the Gettysburg Campaign by Jon Nese and Jeff Harding. You can get your copy. Fascinating book. John, Jeff, thanks so much for spending some time to tell us about it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Chris.
I'm Chris Mikowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.